The smell of salt water mingled with the acre odor of pain and despair. The Amistad ship cut the dark waters of the Atlantic, its wooden hull ranging under the weight of a human burden that should never be treated as such. They were more than 50 Africans, captured in their villages, where the rising sun warmed the earth, and freedom was an inalienable right, now reduced to numbers, to human value goods. In the basement of the ship, the air was thick and suffocating. The iron chains that held them were cold against the skin, a constant reminder that their destinations no longer belonged to them. Each swing of the sea was a cruel warning, a macabre dance that packed them on nightmares that had no end. The ocean that was once a symbol of vastness and freedom now seemed a relentless jailer. The screams were a symphony of suffering, interspersed only by the harsh commands of the sailors who treated them with brutal indifference. "They get up, your worms!" He had one of them, his voice cutting the air like a whip. They obeyed, not by submission, but for the faint hope that following orders could spare them from the wrath of the men who kept them captive. Among the prisoners was Cinque, a man whose haughty possession had not been doubled by the chains. He watched everything with eyes that didn't know the surrender. In his homeland, he was a leader, recognized for his courage and intelligence. Now he was reduced to a number, but in his heart, the spirit of resistance burned as indomitable fire. He knew that survival depended more than just on the body. It was necessary to keep the mind sharp, the living hope. Each day, Chinky studied the faces of the men who enslaved them, memorizing their habits, their weaknesses. He realized that while some were merciless, others showed a tip of hesitation, a spark of humanity, and it was this spark that he planned to turn into a fire. Hope told him that, as immense as the ocean it was, he was not invincible. Freedom could be reached, even if the price was high. Time at sea was cruelly indefinite, the days and nights merging into an oppressive eternity. But for Cinque, every moment was an opportunity to learn, to plan. He communicated his ideas in whispers, spending messages from one prisoner to another, an invisible wire of resistance that stretched through that dark basement. The ship followed its course. The horizon line was always out of reach, but within Cinque the line of hope was visible. He refused to accept that their fate was sealed. He knew freedom was a struggle that began in mind, and was determined to fight until the last breath. The ocean could be vast, but it was no longer vast than the human spirit. And so, as the Amistad sailed, carrying his burden of suffering, Cinque and his companions carried something much more powerful: the determination that one day the echo of their chains would become the sound of freedom. They could not destroy the ocean, but they could conquer the only thing the ocean could never take away from them: the will to fight. The salty flavor of the night air was a promise of freedom to Sankei and his companions. The moon, a silent witness in heaven, spilled its silver light on the Amistad deck, illuminating faces marked by determination and despair. The night was his ally, a protective curtain that hid their movements from those who kept them chained. The stars above seemed to shine with a renewed purpose, as if they reflected the hope that burned on each African's chest on board. Cinque had spent days studying the rhythms of the guards, every step of his routine, every moment of distraction. He knew that, under the veil of the night, the men who watched them trusted the tiredness, their minds dulled by the marullar of the waves and the hypnotic balance of the ship. It was in this state of relaxation that Cinque planned to launch his attack, a quick and decisive blow that could change the course of his destinations. With an almost imperceptible nod, Cinque signaled to his companions. They moved as shadows, sliding and silent, each with a clear mission. The makeshift tools, weapons created from the very structure of the ship, were firmly in their hands. They were pieces of wood, metal fragments, anything that could become an extension of their indomitable will. They were not trained warriors, but the need and despair made them dangerous. The first attack was fast and fierce. One of the guards, I caught completely by surprise, fell without emitting a sound, his body reaching the deck with a thud. The blood that gushed from his body was a silent testimony of the change of power that was underway. In the next instant, the whole deck plunged into the chaos. Shouts of dread and fury cut the silence of night, and the ship, which until then navigated serene, became a battlefield. Cinque led his men with the ferocity of a lion. His eyes shone with an intensity that none of his oppressors could match. He moved with a lethal accuracy, every calculated blow, each movement a statement of his humanity. He knew that the battle was not enough. It was necessary to send a clear message that they were not just victims, but human beings fighting for their dignity and freedom. The oppressors, caught by surprise, fought to react, but fear and confusion were his worst enemies. In the midst of the riot, some tried to organize, shouting orders that were drowned out of the sounds of the conflict. However, the advantage was with those who had everything to lose. Each African struggled not only by himself, but for those who left behind, by the villages destroyed, by the lives that were stolen. The sea, a ruthless witness of the drama that unfolded over its waters, seemed to rise in solidarity with the enslaved. The waves beat the hull, like muffled applause, while the blood of the oppressors mingled with the ocean foam. The wind, which once carried only the smell of pain and despair, now brought the promise of a new dawn. Finally, the sound of the combat began to decrease. The bodies of oppressors lay scattered throughout the deck, while the survivors, those who had been defeated by the courage of the Africans, were gathered and tied. Cinque looked around, his chest panting with the intensity of the moment. He knew that victory was just the beginning of a much larger fight. But for now, the sweet taste of freedom was a balm on the wounds of their souls. With the Amistad under his control, Cinque and his companions turned the rudder toward the rising sun. The vastness of the ocean that once looked like a prison now opened before them as a way to freedom. They had challenged their oppressors and won, turning a night of despair into a new day of hope. And so, under the starry sky, the Amistad sailed once again, not as a slave ship, but as a symbol of resistance and courage. The promise of freedom was now a palpable reality, a destination they were determined to achieve, cost what it cost. The sun was born lazy over the horizon, dyeing the chalide-colored sky that contrasted with the scatter cold from the ocean to dawn. The Amistad, now under the command of the Africans led by Cinque, cut the waters with a renewed purpose. The victory in the battle on board had been a tasty triumph, but the bitterness of uncertainty soon settled. The promise to return to Africa, to review their lands and their people, was the wire of hope that kept them firm, but the reality was much more treacherous than they could imagine. Cinque, with the countenance marked by the responsibility and the unshakable determination, spent hours on the deck, the fixed eyes on the horizon in search of the promised land. He was not alone. Beside him, his companions were looking forward to, their eyes alternating between confidence in the leader and the whispering doubt that the unknown always brings. The vastness of the ocean was a cruel reminder of his precarious situation. They had won the ship, but the sea did not forgive illusions. At night, when the dark cloak descended over the Amistad, it was when surviving crew, forced to lead the ship, became the true masters of fate. Under the vigilant gaze of the Africans, they disguised their true intention, promising to follow the course towards Africa, while in the shadows they subtly altered the rudder, guiding the ship towards the back of America. It was a game of deceit, where the hope of the freeders crashed into the cunning of those who wished to see them chained again. The days turned into weeks, an eternity of endless days and insome nights. Each sunrise brought with it a new wave of frustrated despair and hope. The sea, with its mortal beauty, seemed to mock its dreams of freedom. Cinque, however, refused to give in to despair. He understood that the struggle for freedom was long and winding, and that each day of survival was, by itself, a little victory. It was a gray morning when the mist was still stubbornly clinging to the surface of the ocean, which the truth turned out to be. An indistinct line broke the horizon. Earth. A murmur of arousal traveled the deck, but was quickly suffocated by the bitter perception that this was not Africa. It was the American coast, an unknown and potentially hostile world. The shock of discovery resonated in every heart. That land represented not the end of his journey, but the beginning of a new battle. Cinque, with the posture of a leader who is not shaken by adversity, gathered his companions. The words he gave were a mixed D and courage and warning. We didn't get to where we expected, but we're here. And here we will continue to fight for the freedom that was stolen to us. As they approached the coast, the ship was spotted by fishermen, who quickly spread the news of a strange ship, full of Africans, approaching. Panic and curiosity mingled with those waiting on land. The arrival of the Amistad became an event, a show that attracted the attention of local authorities. The news spread quickly, and soon the Amistad was intercepted by an American military ship. On board, Africans were again subdued, this time not by iron chains, but for a legal system that they knew little and did not even recognize their humanity. The judgment would be followed would put in proof not only their lives, but the principles of freedom and justice of an entire nation. Cinque and his companions, torn from one nightmare to another, faced the new reality with the same determination that had led them to conquer the ship. They knew justice was not a guaranteed promise, but a battle to be fought with words as sharp as swords. In the land of freedom, they would seek to judge their own freedom, challenging a system that saw them as less than humans. The journey of uncertainty then became the struggle for recognition and dignity. In a court, they would tell their stories, their voices echoing like a cry for justice that could not be ignored. The fate of the Africans of the Amistad would intertwine with the fate of a nation, and their voices, once drowned out by the ocean, would resonate hard on the pages of history. The court hall was impregnated with a tinnitus of restless murmurs, such as a human hive about to explode in frenzy. The case of Africans of the Amistad had polarized public opinion, becoming a show that attracted multitudes of curious journalists and abolitionist activists. That day, the court doors opened for a trial that would not only define the destiny of the accused, but would also force America to confront their own contradictions. Cinque and his companions, dressed in simple but worthy clothes, were sitting on a bank reserved for the defendants. His eyes were firm, his erect postures, as if they symbolized the struggle they waged not only by themselves, but by all who had been reduced to human goods. The currents that once arrested them had been removed, but the weight of prejudice and injustice still hung heavily over their shoulders. The accusation, led by lawyers who represented the interests of those who saw Africans as property, painted a dark picture. They were described as indomitable savages, guilty of piracy and murder, too dangerous to be left free. The defense, however, was composed of a group of passionate abolitionist lawyers, led by Roger Baldwin, who saw in that case an opportunity to challenge the laws that supported slavery. The judge, an austere figure with a critical look, presided over the court with the responsibility of maintaining order amid growing chaos. What was at stake was more than the freedom of Cinque and his companions. It was the very definition of humanity and the inalienable rights that should be granted to all, regardless of skin color or origin. The early days of the trial were devoted to detailed reports from the Amistad trip, from the capture of Africans to the rebellion on board. Witnesses were called, including surviving sailors, who painted a picture in tones of fear and violence. However, the turning point came when the defense presented their central argument. Africans were free citizens of their natal lands, illegally kidnapped and transported to a world that treated them as goods. The rebellion in the Amistad was therefore an act of self-defense, a struggle desperate for freedom. Cinque was called to the witness bank. With a translator by his side, he narrated the story of his life, from the village where he was born to the moment he was chained on a slave ship. His voice, although marked by a slight accent, was clear and firm. He spoke of the atrocities committed by his captors and the indescribable suffering that he and his companions had endured. But more than anything, he spoke of dignity, the impossibility of resigning himself to a life of servitude. "In my land, I am a free man," said Cinque, his fixed eyes on the judge. "We fight because freedom is a right that no one can steal us. We are not pirates. We are not murderers. We are men who want to live in peace." Cinque's words echoed through the court, playing the audience in a way that few lawyers' speeches could. There was a tense silence, as if everyone was holding the aspiration, before the murmur resumed, more insidious and more emotion than ever. The trial extended for weeks, each session bringing new arguments, new witnesses, and increasing pressure both inside and outside the court. The country seemed divided. On the one hand, those who saw Africans as heroes of a just struggle. On the other, those who feared the precedent that their liberation could establish. The court had become a battlefield where ideologies collided, and the tension was palpable, as a storm about to explode. Finally, after days of deliberation, the verdict was announced. The courtroom was crowded, the heavy air with anticipation. The judge got up, his solemn expression echoing the historical moment in which he was about to participate. In a voice that was not cheated, he stated that the Africans of the Amistad were, in fact, free men, illegally kidnapped, and that they had the right to fight for freedom. The hall exploded in a cacophony of applause, shouts of joy, and angry protests. Cinque and his companions rose, their unbelieving but radiant expressions. They had won a monumental battle, not just for their lives, but for human dignity. At that moment, they became symbols of hope and resistance, inspiring future generations to fight oppression and injustice. The Amistad trial not only changed the course of life on board, but also left an indelible mark in U.S. history. It was a powerful reminder that the struggle for freedom is universal and eternal, transcends borders, and challenges oppression in all its forms. And while Africans were preparing to return to their lands, their voices continued to echo, a reminder that true freedom begins with the recognition of each individual's humanity. The U.S. Supreme Court Hall in Washington was full of an atmosphere of gravity and expectation. The imposing walls, decorated with majestic columns, seemed to almost compress the space, as if they wanted to retain the breadth of importance of what was about to happen. At the center of that solemn environment, Cinque and his companions were positioned once more, but this time with the burning hope that justice would finally prevail. The Amistad case, which had captured the nation's attention, was now in the hands of the highest court in the country. In the steps of the entrance, multitudes clustered, eager for news that confirmed the triumph of freedom on oppression. The winter of 1841 was rigorous, but the cold was no match for the fervor of those waiting outside, breathing the cold air as if every puff were a silent cry of support. Within the court, the judges, in their black robes, took their seats with dignity that only the responsibility of deciding on human lives could check. Among them, Court President Roger B. Taney, whose austere countenance hid the complexities of a man in conflict with the laws of his time. The accusation, still firm in his convictions, resorted to the same old narratives of property and order, but this time their voices sounded hollow, devoid of the force that once seemed unquestionable. On the other hand, the African defenders, led by men like John Quincy Adams, former President of the United States and fervent abolitionist, were ready to make history. Adams, whose presence in court seemed to inject a palpable energy into the air, began his speech with an eloquence that transcended the walls of that room. He not only defended Africans, he challenged his own nation to reevaluate himself. "We are not just here to decide the fate of these men," he began, his resonant voice echoing in the corners of the hall. "We are here to decide the fate of our own principles." Cinque, sitting among his companions, absorbed each word with an intensity that seemed to feed his soul. He knew he was facing a crucial moment, not just for him and his friends, but for all who had been oppressed and dehumanized. With each argument presented, he felt the tide of justice starting to change. The testimonials were again presented, but this time with a weight that only time and reflection can check. The stories of horror and resilience of Africans were heard. Their once stuffy voices now echoed with the force of 1,000 thunder. The room was silent, except for the sound of Adams's words, which in its fervor drew a clear line between morality and the current law. "These men are not commodities," Adams proclaimed, pointing to Africans with an emphatic gesture. "They are human beings, endowed with inalienable rights that cannot be denied by the color of their skin or where they came from." The trial extended to days that looked like an ETE righty, each session bringing with it an increase in tension and hope. Outside, the crowds refused to disperse, even when the night fell, their faces illuminated by the trembling light of the lamps and the flame of conviction. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The Supreme Court room was crowded, the air thick with anticipation. Judge Taney, with an expression that suggested the severity of the moment, rose to announce the decision. Silence was absolute, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for a sentence that would determine the course of history. "The Supreme Court of the United States has decided," Taney began, his voice cutting the silence with the clarity of a bell, "that Africans aboard the Amistad ship are illegally kidnapped men and have the right to return to their natal lands." The statement was received with an explosion of emotions. Tears of joy sprouted in Cinque's eyes and his companions, while applause and shouts of celebration echoed both inside and outside the court. The victory was not just theirs, but of all who believed that freedom was an inalienable right, greater than any current could arrest. The Supreme Court verdict was a milestone not only for the Africans of the Amistad, but to the nation's own spirit. For the first time, American law recognized that freedom was greater than shackles, that human dignity did not know borders. While Cinque and his companions were preparing for the return trip to Africa, their heads raised and their hearts full of gratitude, they knew they had become something more than simple survivors. They became symbols of resistance and hope, an inspiration to all who continued to fight for justice in a world that often forgot the meaning of freedom. And so, under the brilliant sky of a new day, they embarked on their journey, knowing that their voices had changed the course of history, and wherever they were, they would carry with them the proof that true freedom begins in the mind and heart of every human being. The year was 1841, and the port of Porto was full of a mixture of salt and expectation. The Africans of the Amistad, now free men, prepared to embark on a new journey, this time with a light heart and indomitable spirit. The ship that would take them back to Africa swung gently, anchored in the port, as well as longing to leave. Cinque, the leader whose courage and determination had led his brothers through the treacherous waters of injustice, was ready to return to the land that had left behind. The farewell on American soil was marked by a silent solemnity. Those who had become friends and allies gathered to see the group leave. The abolitionists who had fought alongside them were present, their expressions reflecting a mixture of sadness and triumph. The victory in the courts not only released Africans, but had also light up a flame of hope in the minds of many who lived under the yoke of oppression. Sinke, with his eyes fixed on the horizon, knew that the journey back was not just a physical return, but a spiritual journey of renewal and reconnection. Every step towards the ship brought back memories of his village, the laughter of children running free, the sound of their people's voices in harmony with the earth. He longed to feel the African soil under his feet, to breathe the air of his homeland, and, above all, to tell the story of his incredible odyssey. Upon boarding, the African group was received with applause and warm greetings from the sailors who, this time, were not jailers, but allies on their release journey. The ship lifted its candles, and as the ropes ranged and the deckwoods crashed, the powerful feeling of belonging and return flooded each other's heart. The trip was not quick, but time in the sea had become. The ocean, once a cruel and relentless jail, was now a path of renewed promises and hopes. Sinke spent the nights under the stars, telling his companions stories of his land, the beauty and strength of his people. His words were loaded with longing, but also of a determination of rebuilding their lives destroyed by the brutality of slavery. Each day, the bond between them was strengthened, a brotherhood forged in the fire of adversity. During the trip, Africans reflected on the impact of their history. They understood that they were not only individuals who had gained freedom, but symbols of resistance to many around the world. Their voices, which had echoed in the courtrooms, would continue to resonate, inspiring those who fought against injustice and oppression. The story of the Amistad had become a lighthouse of hope, a reminder that freedom is a powerful force, capable of transcending the bar of time and space. When they finally spotted the African coast, the cry of joy that burst on board was spontaneous and contagious. Tears of emotion ran free, while the land of their ancestors became visible, cutting the horizon with its family forms. The smell of the earth, brought by the wind, was a sweet and overwhelming memory of everything they had lost and were about to recover. The landing was a moment of pure euphoria. Sankei, by stepping on African soil, knelt down and touched the floor with reverence, feeling the unbreakable connection with its ancestors. His companions followed their example, and together they promised to honor the memories of those who had been lost, rebuilding their lives with their strength and dignity that had been almost torn to them. The reception in his villages was warm and thrilled. The stories of his journey and his victory resonated throughout the region, making them heroes in the midst of their people. They shared their experiences, not just as survivors, but as bearers of a message of hope and resistance. The freedom they had gained was not only yours, but a legacy for future generations. The story of the Amistad, marked by courage and resilience, crossed oceans and centuries, remembering the world that even at the bottom of despair, freedom always finds a way. Sankei and his companions, once enslaved and stripped of his humanity, became eternal symbols of resistance and hope. And in their homeland, they lived as free men, proving to themselves and the world that human dignity cannot be denied, and that true freedom begins in the indomitable spirit of each individual.